Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into today's episode of the Money Insights Podcast. My name is Christian Allen. I'm here with my co-host. You know him lovingly as Rod the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what's up, man?
Hey, I am doing great. As we like to say, I am living the dream.
Living the dream. Amen, brother. Okay, that's my favorite. In fact, this was just kind of a joking thing. You have to know that this is sarcasm, but my internet name was Living the Dream. So
Okay.
It was because whenever we would ask each other, it would be Living the Dream, like sarcastically. And I'm talking like years ago when I was like struggling, you know. I'm not talking about like today's living. I don't know what our internet's name today, but I remember vividly that when I was like younger, kind of sarcastically, jokingly, it was Living the Dream. But Rod, I'm glad to hear that you are living the dream. I'm also excited to talk about 529 plans. And more specifically, I'm excited to talk about the plan trap.
Yeah.
And we're going to boldly declare that this is a flawed strategy, a highly flawed strategy, even not just flawed, Rod, highly flawed. And we're going to get into why. So what do you think of that?
We have the proof. We have it. So I have no problem.
I hope you're going to put your
with
best
a bold
foot forward,
statement
Rod.
like that.
We better come out guns blazing, right?
That's right.
Okay, so imagine this, Rod. Imagine this situation. Just like picture this.
Okay.
You start up a 529 plan when your daughter Julianne's 2 years old, right?
Okay.
2 years old. You fund that thing regularly. Keep going after it. Now it's 20 years later, and she gets to college age, and she's like, I don't really want to go to college. In fact, I don't want anything to do with it. I'm gonna go start a business.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, sorry, Julianne, you kind of have to. We have this money here and that's what it's for. You're going to college, dang it. And she's like, but that's not my path. Now I get it. Julianne's really smart and she went to college. Great. But Rod, imagine that situation. So the question is, what do you do? Now, be clear, there's some caveat, right? There's some ways to get out of it. But the point is that there's just huge restrictions. And that's what we're going to get into. We're going to get into some of the primary restrictions that exist around 529 plans. And I hope that we can make a really compelling argument for why better alternatives. I would say even alternatives plural, but we're going to, of course, focus on one alternative that we feel like is better than all the rest of the alternatives that we're aware of. Now, I always like to tell people we're open. If you can show us a better way, please, we are open to learning, always excited to learn. But at this moment, we're going to show you what we believe to be the best strategy that is much, much better than funding a 529 plan. So, Rod, the first thing that we need to do, as always, we've got to make sure that there's context because not everybody listening to this knows exactly how 520. I think everyone knows 529 plans are for specifically government plans, IRS plans specifically designated for funding school, college, education, right? Yeah. But not everyone's going to know how they work. So break it down for us, help us understand how they work so that we can get into the pros and cons from there.
Yeah. So as we say on a very regular basis, the tax code is built to be incentives. So whatever the government wants you to do, they'll incentivize you through tax. And so in this case, they want people to go get educated, right? They want an educated population. And so in order to incentivize people to save up so they can send their kids to college, they built these plans. And so they're tax advantaged. So we'll talk about kind of the tax advantages here in just a minute. They're typically, so I was saying that as the federal government, which is true, but also at the state level, there are some additional layers that work at the kind of state government level. So let's talk about the tax. Typically, like in most states, you put the money in and it's after tax, but it grows tax-free and you never pay that tax as long as it's used for qualified education expenses.
Okay, so it sounds to me like a Roth IRA at that point.
Very similar. Yep, very similar.
Okay.
And in some states, they do give you some additional tax advantages on the way in as you're putting that money into the plan. So again, that's state to state, but in a lot of places,
but it does exist. And in that way, it's an improvement on a Roth IRA if money's used for education. Okay. Is that fair to say?
Yep.
Okay. I'm with you.
Now, I talked about how it has to be used for qualified education expenses. And basically that includes tuition, fees, books, room and board, the kinds of things that are specific, like very specific to the education. Because people out there, they try to get creative. Oh, well, what if I use it for whatever XYZ other things that are in the periphery? And the answer is no. It's very specific to those items.
Okay, so we have to make sure that we understand the tax implications,
Mhm.
and it does sound like those tax implications are all positive to me, right?
Sure. Yeah.
I think
Who
they
wouldn't
are
want to use
positive.
tax advantaged money? If you're
Right.
putting money aside to send someone to college, your child to college anyway, why not do it where you can get some tax advantages?
Okay, so far so good. I'm with you. And then of course, like you said, now we're getting into a little bit more of like some of the challenges, but again, as long as you are pretty certain you're going to put money in and it's going to go toward education, then there's some value. It is a
Yeah.
genuine value proposition, right?
Yeah. And one thing that I haven't hit on yet is that you might ask, okay, great. So I put that money aside, but what is it doing between the time I set it aside when she was 2 years old or whatever, and later when she's ready to use it? And the answer is this is where the states get involved, and they'll have state sponsored plans where it's kind of like if you've ever signed up for a 401k, you show up and they say, here is the list of investment options you can choose from. The state has done something very similar. And so you're just picking from the list of options that they give you.
Yeah, that is really important. We're going to get into this, in fact. So let's talk. Okay, do we feel like we've created enough context so that everybody understands what a
I think
529
so.
plan is?
Yeah, I think we've
Okay.
hit on.
Okay, I think we
Yeah.
have too. I feel good about this. So let's now start to talk. We're already into the downsides, Rod. We're going to really blast this thing. Okay, are you ready?
Okay.
So,
Yep.
ready, set, go. I'm just kidding. Okay, 529 plan trap downsides start with number one, a lack of flexibility. So, you remember my what if situation, Rod?
Yep.
We talked about Julianne early on, decide not to go to college. She's going to start a business. Well, what does she do? So, let's talk about okay, well, actually, we won't talk about the solution for how we can get out of there necessarily right this second. But again, just at the very simple, in the
That's
very simplest terms, let's say that I have one child, and that child, I use a 529, and they decide they're not going to college. Now that money is either going to, I'm going to have to shift it. How do I shift it, Rod? I don't even know what the answer is. I know if I have a bunch of kids, then I might be able to shift it to another kid, right?
Yeah.
So that can be like a way to offset or help in case of that type of a situation. But what if I have one kid, I'm not able to shift anything? Do I just pay the interest and penalties? Call it a day?
Yes. So you have two options. You either pay the tax on it because you didn't use it for a qualified expense, but there is an additional penalty, 10% penalty. It basically starts to act like a retirement account. If you're withdrawing from your retirement account early, it's a very similar thing. So that's one option. Second option
Okay.
is leave it there and literally turn it into a retirement account. Let it become a Roth that you then wait till you're ready to retire, and then you take the money out then.
Okay, so you're telling me that the one of the options is to use it as a retirement account. You're saying you can transition it without any penalties into a regular retirement account, right?
Right.
Okay, so again, I want to be as fair and transparent as possible on both sides. So far, I think like there's some real pros and cons to it, right? Like I think that there is a value proposition that exists there, and there are at least some ways to get out of it. So, so far that's like not a terrible thing. Okay, let's keep getting into some of the other situations. Our second problem, Rod, and this is where we probably start to really divide in terms of philosophy. But the second thing is that there's just incredibly limited investment options. So you describe and specifically marker. So the first thing is that from an investment option standpoint, you're going to have a handful of mutual funds as your options, right? The state defines what those are. They typically do stuff that's like pretty conservative, had been there for a long time. They feel like they know it's going to be something that can perform, which again, you can understand why, right? This money is designated for education.
Right.
But you're also realizing in that moment that you're not the person choosing how to invest the money. You have to live inside of that pretty limited space, which, by the way, isn't just limited to a few mutual funds. It's limited to exclusively the market and a few mutual funds. So we're talking about anything outside of that I might typically be able to invest in. That's suddenly money that can only go into that handful of, mutual funds, money market accounts. And Rod, I even looked up some of the historical interest rates some of
Okay.
the historical returns that some of like the more notable states that have them. So I'm going to throw a couple out
Okay.
there. Okay. So here's just some things to keep in mind. As of the fourth quarter of 2024, 5-year average annual returns for top performing 529 plans ranged between 6.1% and 8.82%. So, for example, the Maryland College Investment Plan was the best one at 8.82%, while the college plan in Colorado had a 5-year average return of 6%. So that's basically where you're at. Now, that's not a bad thing. Again, it's like it's a pretty conservative return, but it's also a return, right? So you've gotten some sort of a tax advantage, you're getting some sort of a return, assuming again that it performs inside of that, and assuming that the volatility isn't hitting you at the wrong time, right?
Right.
Actually, we
Yeah,
haven't even
very
talked about this, but we've also got another issue, which is just the timing risk, the same kind of sequence of returns risk that we talk about in retirement when we're doing the traditional retirement income planning. I have that same issue. What if the market as a whole isn't performing at the time when I need the money most? And maybe there's still money available to get, to do some stuff. But the point here is that you're taking it out at the very worst time, the time when you're literally doing the opposite of the mantra that we all hope to live by from an investment standpoint: buy low, sell high. If you sell because you have to, you need that money when the market's down 20%, like that's going to have a huge impact on how quickly you run through the rest of the money.
Especially because you did some meticulous planning when you decided how much money you're going to set aside, anticipating how much it will cost to put your child through school. The cost of education just kept going up. And so you were feeling like, okay, I might scrape by and have enough to put them through college. And then the market drops and it's time to send them to college. And now you're like, okay, what am I going to do? Right.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the problems I think about here, Rod, is just the lack of control, right? We talk about limited investment options and having to be at the mercy of the market. But most of the people who we talk to, most of the people who I view as prolific wealth builders, really value control of their money and efficiency of their money, right? So I would just suggest that a lot of people, especially people that listen to this podcast and people who, in the alternative space, would look at the returns and the lack of control and say, I'm not getting enough of a return there to give up all that control. Whereas I might just rather take that money and put it into business opportunities. Like there might be there might be a dozen other things that I feel like are likely to produce a better overall return for me over that time frame and give me the flexibility and control that can come with that. So
what I hear you saying is you might be willing to give up these tax advantages that they're giving you if it means you have more control, invest more in the things that you want. Like you're still setting aside the same money, but you're actually investing it in the places that you choose, that you feel comfortable with, that are going to, again, you feel like are going to give you better returns, have better other opportunities that come with them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And and I like that you mentioned that we're comparing now just investments without tax benefits, but more control, to investments that have tax benefit, but lack control.
Yep.
Even in that situation, if all things were equal, I think a lot of people would feel like I can just produce a better overall return that I'm more comfortable with, again, investing in the things I do, like those types of assets. It just makes a huge difference. People are going to want to go that direction. But Rod, there's more to it. And we're going to get into that side in just a minute. Okay. I want to make sure that we get into this problem 3. It's one that that most people probably aren't thinking of, but I'm just going to throw it in there as food for thought. Realizing that most people that listen to this are never going to have any need for or qualify for financial aid. It's still important to note that the 529 plan will count against FAFSA, and FAFSA is just financial aid for college education. So the counterpoint that we're going to make in a minute is that there's a way we can do some things with other assets that won't count against that and will give you other similar benefits. Okay.
Yeah.
So first thing we talked about was just the lack of flexibility that exists. And again, I kind of I should probably put lack of control, lack of flexibility. Both of those
Mhm.
things kind of exist as our primary issue. The second one was just the limited investment options, and again, emphasizing the fact that those limited investment options keep you totally in the market. So it's not like there's a few alternative assets. It's just there's a few mutual funds, a handful of
Right.
mutual funds.
And there's no such thing as a self-directed 529 plan.
No, great point. No, not that I'm aware of. I have not seen it. And then problem number 3 that we hit on was just the FAFSA thing. Okay. Anything else you feel like we should hit on?
Maybe inside of the lack of flexibility side, we talked about if your child just doesn't go to school. What if they do, but they get a scholarship? Because that's actually
Yes.
the case with Julianne. She did
Yeah.
end up going to school,
That
but
makes a
she
lot more
got
sense.
a pretty strong scholarship. And so then it's like, okay, well, good for her. I love
Yes,
the fact
that's
that she
amazing.
did that. And yet now here I still am sitting like, okay, but now what am I going to do with all this money? So that's obviously a problem.
Again, yeah. Okay, keep going with that.
Now the one, and I'll clarify this because apparently I understand that you're, to the extent that they get a scholarship, you can remove that money from the plan without paying the penalty, but you still owe the
Yes.
tax on the earnings. So it's not like it's like free pass because hey, your kid did great, good job. It's still you're paying the tax on it. And then the other thing that we hit on a lot, just in terms of liquidity and other things like that, what if you just need the money for something else? What if you get in a bind, you have an emergency situation, whatever, and now it really is very much like the retirement accounts that we have a problem with, where I put all this money into the 401k. In this case, we put it into the 529, and it's not that I can't get it out of there. I just have to pay a lot to do it, pay the tax, pay the penalty.
Yeah, good points. Okay, I think those are strong points, Rod. Let's turn our attention to the solution. The way that we feel like just makes more sense, and no one listening to this is going to be surprised. But we very much believe that a better alternative is using high cash value life insurance, right? So as always, the caveat needs to be the policy has to be built for high cash value.
Right.
So it's always frustrating when I get into conversations with people who say things like, "Oh, life insurance shouldn't be for XYZ life," but I know that they're talking about a policy that isn't designed to do anything but pay out a death benefit. And so in that way, they're very much right. But what's frustrating is they're also so wrong. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, they're right in that if things are done that way, then that's the outcome. But if things are done a different way, then there's a very, very different outcome.
Right.
So it's a frustrating thing. In fact, Rod, I got into it with someone on LinkedIn I think it was yesterday or the day before, because they were like, young physicians should buy term and invest the difference. That's the only way to do it. And I was like, young physicians should buy term insurance. They should also use high cash value life insurance as an opportunity to invest in alternative assets. We diverged in some of those things. They just said, nope, physicians, they don't need to complicate their lives. They should keep it simple. And I was like, I think they should do it effectively. You guys can keep it simple. We'll do it effectively. And we'll just compare and see who ends up ahead,
Did you get any feeling that they had any context for the type of policy you were talking about?
When I tried to give that caveat and describe it, they did throw a bone like, oh, for specific strategies, I think it can be used. But my thought was that they're enlightened enough around life insurance to think, okay, there could be some moments where I could use this effectively, but somehow that effectiveness wasn't being carried down to a young physician, which in my mind is the perfect time to start utilizing high cash value life insurance as an opportunity to invest for the future.
Yep.
Right?
How many times have we heard seasoned, we'll say physicians because that was the category, but really across the board, say, man, I wish I would have started this 10 years, 15, 20 years ago, right?
I dare say 1,000 times.
Yeah.
Maybe more. We've heard it. Oh, why didn't I understand this earlier? The reason we didn't understand it, by the way, is because of people like this guy I'm talking about who were advocating something because they heard it come out of Dave Ramsey's book or something. I don't want to give Dave Ramsey all the credit, but you know what I mean. Okay.
Pretty consistent message.
Okay. Now we're going to talk about high cash value life insurance and how it applies specifically to college funding and why it's a better alternative. So let's start with flexibility, Rod. why is flexibility, one, why is it important maybe overall? And
Sure.
what is the flexibility inside of high cash value life insurance like, and how is it different than the 529?
Yeah, so let's start with the original premise, right? We wanted the 529 plan for the tax benefits. That's the draw to putting it in there. And then we talked about what happens after that. But let's start there with the life insurance. Money you're putting into life insurance policy is after tax. It grows tax deferred, you take it out tax free. So it's sounding an awful lot from a tax standpoint like what we liked about the 529 plan to begin with, right? So now for as far as flexibility goes, if you can have the same tax treatment and regardless of what your child decides to do, you have access to that money and can help them achieve that. So let's go back to your example of the child doesn't go to school because they want to start a business. Well, they need
And you say,
capital.
great, here's the money for the business.
Yep, it's all
Weird.
saved up, ready to go.
It doesn't make any, you can use it for anything.
No restrictions.
Man, that's a big one. That's a
No
big one.
penalties.
So for
no-
somebody like me, that really speaks to me because guess what? I'm somebody who dropped out of college early and started my business, right? Like
Yeah.
that's the path that I decided to take. And
Yeah.
it was absolutely one that felt and has been right for me. So anyway, it's the thought that everybody has to go in that one specific direction is just absolutely ludicrous.
And in some ways, I like your example even more because you started on the education side. Great. The money from the
Yep.
policy can be used, for the tuition that you did pay. Great. There's the money. And then when you transitioned and you said, never mind, it's not going to happen, the money transitions with you.
Yeah, no problems, no hassle. It's just seamless.
Yep.
Okay, so that's important. The tax treatment is critical. And Rod, while we're on it, I'm just going to throw it out there. It gets better than that, though, because not only do we have the ability to take money from the policy or borrow against tax free, but I also have the benefit of a death benefit, which is likely going to be significantly higher than the cash value. So now it works as like a tool to create generational wealth. If I pass, I'm going to pass. When I pass, it's then going to either pay back the loan and then pay back whatever death benefit is still left over to my heirs, or it's just going to be a death benefit that's free and clear and goes to my family. But one way or another, I'm getting this extra benefit without any downside, right? It's like, It's like I'm still able to create the same types of returns because I can invest anywhere, right? My tax treatment on the policy money is exactly the same, but now in addition to that, I just have this fun little death benefit that's, I'm not paying for in another way, right? I'm not having to buy term insurance to get it. It's a huge benefit, right? And again, it's something that most people aren't thinking about, but if we're talking about the goal of building generational wealth, I want to know that my plan succeeds no matter whatever point in time that I croak. Sorry to be a little, but the reality is I want to make sure that it's going to work at any time. And this is a tool that helps us do it. It multi-purposes our money in a way that's just like unique, right? So anyway, that's the first thing that comes to mind.
And if you pass away before they end up going to school, you remember the good old days when we would sit down with people and do needs-based planning and we would say, hey, we need to replace your income. What other things would not happen if you weren't around to earn the income to make it happen? And college was a very common answer to that. Okay, great. So the money is there to pay for college. If everything goes as planned and you survive, you live beyond the time your child's going to college, then great. But if you didn't, then to your point, this much larger number, this death benefit pays out and takes care of that. And we always talk about optimizing the policy towards building the cash value. But in all cases, especially when you look at in the early years of the policy, the death benefit that comes off of it is a multiple times what you have in your cash value, right? And I say early on because you haven't put much money in, but immediately you have this death benefit that's 12 to 15x what you have in your cash value, and that number gets closer together again because we optimize it towards that. But no matter what, it's always multiple times more that you get in the death benefit than what you have in your cash value.
Yeah, and so that ultimately just creates additional value that if I'm comparing directly with with a 529 plan, right? If let's just say all things were equal, I don't think they are, but let's just say all things were equal, but then one had a death benefit. Well, you would be like, oh, well, I want that one, right? Pretty simple. Okay. So liquidity and control, Rod, have we talked about? Do we feel like we've hit on like the overall liquidity? Obviously, life insurance is, we're just saying it's totally liquid. I can get to it for any reason at any time. Simple as that.
Yeah, no penalties, whatever. Like it's just accessible.
Okay. The FAFSA thing there, we talked about this already, but there's no FAFSA impact. So life insurance is totally, it's kind of like the asset protection element of life insurance. It's just one of the other kind of ancillary benefits that for whatever reason, the IRS up to this point in time has been quite friendly as it relates to life insurance, which by the way, is a big part of why we use it. Okay. So no FAFSA impact, market protection. So maybe the better way to say this is like, what can I invest in, Rod? Because we're kind of trying to highlight the differences, and maybe what would be helpful in this moment is just to talk through what it would look like if I was using this for college education. What types of things am I able to invest in? How is it different from the typical five or six mutual funds that are available to me?
Yeah.
And I might be understating it. It might be 10 or 15 mutual funds, but the point is like,
Sure.
it's pretty limited.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, there are different types of life insurance policies you can choose from whole life, which is very predictable, grows very consistently in the way it grows. Index universal life has a little more volatility to it. On average, you're expecting to get a higher return into it. And then, obviously there's variable universal life. We're not necessarily promoting that because now you get into that same situation where you have that market exposure, same level of market exposure. But let's stick with whole life and IUL. So I'm describing what's happening inside of the policy, but I can access the money and use it to go out and invest. So the investment optimizer strategy now kicks in. I can access that money, use it to go out and invest in whatever I want. So going back to your comment earlier, wouldn't it be nice if I like investing in, name it, right? Businesses, real estate, oil and gas, notes, funds, all kinds of other things that the state doesn't offer in their 529 plan. But if I'm using this kind of a policy, I can access the funds while we're in this deferral period and before the child's ready to go to college, and invest in whatever I want, whatever I feel best about.
And Rod, while I'm investing in those assets, many of them, again, because we're promoting the alternative space, are going to have built-in tax benefits, right? So I'm getting tax benefits on the policy itself, right? We talked about how I put money in after tax, it grows tax-free. I borrow against the policy, the death benefit pays it back. So it's ultimately money that's completely tax-free from a growth perspective. But then in addition to that element of taxation, now I'm investing, if I'm investing in some of the things you gave an example of, let's just say it is real estate. Now I'm also building on it depreciation and things like that, which can create an additional layer of tax benefit, right?
Yeah.
So let's just go back for a second though. Let's just say we were comparing policy only to the 529 plan. In other words, let's just say my money is stuck in the policy. I'm not using investment optimizer strategy to go invest in other things. I'm literally stuck. I'm staying inside that policy. Let's talk about what that looks like. Just because, again, I want to just kind of try to put this out there and make it as clear as possible. So in the 529 plan, I've got in it whatever money I've put into it, plus the return that I've gotten with the tax benefits that exist, right?
Yep.
So now let's go over to the life insurance side. Let's use whole life as a starting point.
Okay.
And we talked about the returns on the 529 side, that we talked about those over the last 5 years being between like 6 and 8%, basically. So now we're over on let's go to the whole life side. We frequently talk about how it grows, right? It's the combination of guaranteed interest rate and dividends. What types of return can people expect inside of whole life? And again, we're just kind of comparing these to what I might be able to get in the 529.
Sure. So your expectation right now, the way that interest rates are and have been, is about 5%.
Okay, so now I have I have the similar tax benefits. Let's say in the whole life policy, I only get 5%, right?
Okay.
I think that over the long run, whole life's probably likely to be higher than that based on what we've seen in historical timeframes. But let's just say it sticks at that 5%. And let's just say that the other one is at 6.5%, 7%, right? So in that situation, I've gotten basically similar tax benefits. I have a little bit better return. And over here, I have a death benefit, but I also have the flexibility and control and all those other things that I can use of whatever I want. Even in that situation, I think a lot of people would look at that and be like, gosh, I don't know if that's enough of a return to give up all of the flexibility and control that I would like to have. And that's, again, just comparing whole life insurance to the 529 plan. And again, we would say properly structured, which in our mind just means minimum cost, maximum cash. But anyway, that's just at that first level. And the next thing I want to do is talk IUL, but tell me what you're going to say.
Yeah, before I do that, and I mean, the whole life, it just is what it is and does what it does, right?
Yeah.
So the market difference, even if you say between now and then you're going to average that 6.5% return, but you still have the risk of the market dropping right before you're ready for it.
So yeah, you don't have your sequence of returns risk because in your whole life it's just going up, right? It's just going up, never going down. And again, like when I look at, returns from the 80s and 90s, they're sitting, they were much higher than what they are today. Right. Now, there's probably a correlation. Market was probably up at a similar time, but the point is like, it's, again, to me, it's not a big enough of a difference in terms of return that I would be like, oh yeah, I'm jumping all in here. I'm going to give up all of my control. It has to go in this very specific direction. Otherwise, I'm going to pay taxes on it, or I'm going to potentially pay penalties, or I'm just going to have to let it sit there until I'm eventually ready to use it as a retirement account. I think a lot of people would say life happens. I can do a lot more with it. It's like a Roth IRA. You can pull it out tax-free. The main difference between your whole life and your IUL is what type of return you can. Well, I shouldn't even say that. The main difference is the way that they credit the return that you're getting. So in whole life, as we talked about, we've got the combination of your guaranteed interest rate. We've got the dividend paying that's been paid out from these insurance companies for the last 180 years. On the IUL side, we've got a cap and a floor. Let's call the cap 10%. I don't know what they're at today. I'm not in the trenches as much. Okay. So 10%, something like that. And let's call the floor 0, right? So now I'm in a situation where I do have a higher potential. And now you're probably something a little bit closer to what the return is in the 529 plan, particularly over a long period of time. I would say that over the long run, I would expect a well-structured IUL to outperform from a return standpoint, a well-structured whole life policy. It's not a guarantee, but that would be like, my expectation.
Historically, that proves out.
Yeah. So now it's like you're basically comparing the same thing, except you've got a higher return. And now you're starting to say like, gosh, like the return difference is probably pretty negligible, right? So if we're saying whole life is getting 5, maybe we're saying IUL's expected to get 6.5. I don't know, something like that, right? So now you're like really close in terms of the return, but you don't have to give up the flexibility, the liquidity, the what if situation of life. All of that nonsense doesn't come with it. And then of course you have, which we're going to talk about next, way more opportunity in terms of where to invest your money.
Yeah. And then on the volatility front, when we talk about whole life, again, it just does what it does. It's so consistent. On the IUL, you have a little more volatility in that. But the thing that you have that makes the biggest difference against what we talked about as far as 529 is you have downside protection. So if your floor is 0, the worst you can do in any given year is not earn any interest, but you don't participate in losses when the S&P or whatever index you're using, when it loses value, you don't participate in those losses. So you don't have that same level of risk as you have on the 529. More risk than what you had on the whole life. But again, on average, over a long period of time,
but you don't have like sequence of returns risk.
Exactly. Yep. Because you don't ever have
negative.
You haven't
lost money. You've just potentially not gained as much in a given year.
Yep.
And that's a very different equation. Okay, but Rod, that's not how it works. We don't have to compare only the life insurance policy as the investment, which, by the way, one of the concepts we so frequently teach is that the insurance is not the investment. By the way, if I was to do I can think of another option. Let's say that I use the capital avalanche strategy and I did premium financing. Say I started when someone was kid, like that would be a much more effective way to, but we can get into that later. I'm just thinking, it just kind of popped into my head. But let's just get back to the core stuff. We always talk about the life insurance is not the investment. The whole concept is built upon leveraging our cash value to go out and invest in particularly alternative assets, cash flowing assets. Like it can obviously be anything, but that's where we feel like we're creating the most value. That's the value proposition becomes greatest. And so now, Rod, you have all of the flexibility in the world. I could just leave my money in there and get a pretty similar to return to the 529, or I could take that money when I feel like it and go do whatever the heck I want. By the way, I can also give it to my kid when they decide they're going to start a business instead of going, to a master's degree because they got a scholarship for the first 4 years.
Yep.
Anyway,
exactly.
Just throwing out all sorts of it just like, if you really think through the elements of it, I feel like it starts to become pretty clear. And I get it. We're life insurance people. This is what we do, right? But I always tell people that doesn't make us wrong, right?
Right.
It doesn't make what we're saying inaccurate. Like at the end of the day, it's just so much more effective. And I do this for myself, right? If I didn't really believe it, I would go out and do the 529. But I understand it really well, and I don't do it because it's less effective.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think the main point that I want people to understand as they walk away from it is that the facts are what really tell the story. And so all we have to do is kind of lay out those facts, compare and understand it. And I believe that most people, if they understand these dynamics, would choose to go with the flexibility, the control, the extra benefits that I can't get inside of my 529 plan. But that's just me, Rod. What are your kind of closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you're saying, and because I just really feel like you get everything that you wanted, right? Okay, maybe not everything. If you could put the money in tax-free and get it out tax-free, that would be better.
Okay, you're right.
But that, aside from that part of it, that piece of it, if your state offers that, and by the way, that only applies to the state tax. You get a deduction on the state tax, not the federal tax.
Right. That's an important. That is an important piece of clarity, because we said at the beginning some states do give some tax benefit, but again, it's not at the federal level. Okay.
Yep. So anyway, getting back to my point, that I can have the money there designated for that purpose and use it for whatever I want. And the other thing is, so now I'm going a couple of different directions, but I'll only hit one of them. I'll get one of them. If I'm someone who wants to use the investment optimizer anyway, and I want to build toward my child's education anyway, well, I can dual purpose my policy to do both. In other words, I'm putting that money aside. It's going to be used to go out and invest in a variety of different things, knowing that I need to have the money back in the plan ready to pay for my child's college on XYZ timeframe. And I'm careful about how I do that and building in extra buffers and all this different stuff to make sure it's there. Why wouldn't I want to do that?
Yeah, that to me makes way more sense, right? If I'm someone who's investing $100,000 as to try to build up my nest egg, but then I say, hey, I want to start doing another $10,000 a year, $20,000 a year to build up my kid's college education. It's just so much more effective to do what you're saying. Add it to the pot, create it as part of that plan. You didn't do that because you did the other stuff because you understood the value and understood how effective it is. It just makes sense that you would do the same thing in this again. And we didn't even talk about leverage, right? We suddenly don't have the ability to use leverage. We talk about alternative. I could go down a whole nother rabbit hole, but we will call it for today. Rod, thank you for all of your thoughts, man. Always,
thank you.
You always deliver. And thanks everybody for listening to us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth-building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.